Hi, I'm Kate.
Hi, I'm Roland.
Hey, I'm Ashna.
And I'm Ethan, and we're going to talk about the clip that you just saw.
For the sake of this video, we'll be referring to the woman cooking in the beginning as Bernarda and the man who breaks in as Carl.
With this first clip of Carl breaking into Bernarda's home, I'm really interested in how the gender and age and circumstances of both the criminal and the victim impact how they should be treated. I think that these things don't impact the punishment.
Yeah, so I agree with what you said, that it's not really about that. It's that when it comes to something like utilitarianism, it's more about the situation and less about the details, because those don't completely matter. It's about the action that was took in a more broad sense.
I think that the circumstances do matter, and that if someone has, for say, example, like a mental disability, there should be equitable forms of punishment because they are given equity in other forms of society. But I do believe that there should still be some punishment because it creates a good deterrent effect and also proves that the crime is wrong.
What do you mean by equitable forms of punishment?
For example, I think that maybe they would get different prison or like regulatory facilities because that would like better suit their needs, because and I'm talking more in the context of like mental disabilities right now, but like even if they have like some other special situation, but it should still be a form of punishment that proves that the action is bad.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that circumstances, specifically on disabilities, are really important because from really young ages, disabled students and people get stigmatized in school. They get left out, they get pushed out of society, and a lot of the times they feel like they don't belong or that they're worth less than a non-disabled person, which puts them into an unending cycle where they're continually pushed out of like society and out of acceptance, which can further them to like commit violent acts more easily. And so I think that punishments aren't necessarily a great way to change this behavior, and rather just reinforce sort of a dominance of like of the non-disabled bodies.
Also, there's interesting research that says that punishment should be aimed towards the crime and not towards alienating the individual. So while the punishment should be there to prove that the crime itself should not be taking place and that it was unjust, it should not be attacking the person or like making them feel like they're an outcast from society.
And like what Ashna said earlier about how they might be able to have a different form of punishment, whether it be a lighter punishment, like less time in prison, something like that, they could also have rehab of some kind where they can try to overcome their difficulties with their mental disability or whatever disability they may have, so that rather than being punished and not knowing what to do right and just know they did something wrong, they can learn what to do right and what to do better next time.
And in the clip, we don't know Bernarda's mental state or circumstances, and we also don't know Carl's mental state or circumstances. But I think that Carl made the decision to break into her home, and even if he is circumstantially like at a loss, or I think that he still made that decision. And should that lessen the crime he deserves or punishment he deserves? Because I think he still chose to do that.
I mean, but in a way, Carl got more punishment than what he deserved because we don't know exactly what he was trying to do and what he was trying to accomplish, and it might have been a bit of an overreaction on Bernarda's part as well.
Yeah, I kind of want to bring the conversation back to like the way that justice should be like handled or put onto like Bernarda. There's a article or a journal from Lazare Radek et al. That talks about how things like reason are very often not objective, and they're very like flavored with or painted with ideas and certain like ways of thinking, which I think is important because there are certain majorities in society, like as I mentioned before, like the non-disabled bodies that are more biased in the ways of like the justice systems. So like having the same punishments against someone who is from a less fortunate background is like not an ethical way of looking at it.
But I think those circumstances don't quite change the crime that was committed. And even though you can empathize, and I think you should empathize, it also doesn't remove the fact that they did commit that crime. And I think that why wouldn't that be ethical if
I think
punishment
that
was dependent on the crime?
I think that the circumstances do change the inherent nature of the crime because, for example, one may not be able to control whether or not they are committing this crime. I read Of Mice and Men by John Steinbeck, and there was this character who killed someone and he strangled someone, but he wasn't able to control it and he wasn't able to stop it. So in that situation, would it be ethical to give them that same punishment if they could not control it?
And in that story, that society didn't accept that person who strangled and killed like animals and such. They didn't accept that sort of mental disability, and they didn't accept that was like a thing that people have. And so, really, I think that the responsibility of things like justice and retribution fall into like acceptance and learning to accommodate for like differences in people.
But I think that in that book, he did also kill someone. And I think that doesn't lessen the fact that he did kill someone. From the victim's point of view, I think that the punishment doesn't depend on the circumstances because they're still the victim and they're still greatly impacted. I read an article by a rape victim at Harvard, and she didn't take legal action, and there were no punishments for her perpetrator, but I think there should have been, regardless of his circumstances, because some crimes are really vile.
Well, would it really be up to you to decide whether or not they should have been punished? Because it would have really just been it really just matters what the victim thinks because they're the only one impacted by it. Wouldn't you agree?
Yes, but the victim also wanted him to be punished. But we're going to see how punishment and responsibility for actions are impacted by circumstances in the next clip.
So, as we see in the clip, Bernarda kills Carl with an egg. And this is kind of interesting because one of my sources, Death Note, talked about how when you're put in a position of power where you can have the ability to kill somebody or just attack them, that idea of power can take over and it can persuade you to take the wrong action, which is generally to kill them. So in this clip, Bernarda didn't have to kill Carl. She could have just chased him out of the house and he would have run off. But because she was put in this situation, she decided that killing him would be the best course of action because of her flight or fight response. And that was just her instinctual response to being threatened by this intruder in her home.
It's actually really interesting to analyze the power relations between a victim and a perpetrator. One of my sources is about human rights violations that happened in the Brazilian government and how the citizens have to struggle to deal with this. And it mentions how being a victim is actually, in some cases, a powerful political tool because these victims can use their position to choose whether or not to accept the perpetrator's apology. So I think that it is interesting to see that like Bernarda had the upper hand and she chose to do this, or she or he chose to do this with their power. And it's interesting to think about how there could have been different courses of actions depending on how Bernarda's train of thought might have strayed.
Though I don't think that it would have been possible for Carl to forgive Bernarda, as he's a little bit dead, just a little bit.
But do those fight or flight responses remove the fact that it was her fault? Like, because she may have been overtaken by power, can she be forgiven?
Well, I don't think she can be entirely forgiven because, for example, one of my other sources talked about the creation of the atomic bomb and the use of that on Japan. And the U.S. is still at fault for bombing Japan and creating the atomic bomb. They're not forgiven for killing hundreds of thousands of people who did nothing wrong and didn't attack us in any way. So I think, yes, she's still at fault for attacking Carl when she didn't have to. It wasn't for her survival. There were other options she could have done. So, yes, she is at fault.
I disagree. I think that they're both mutually at fault. Maybe not at the same scale, but definitely Carl started it by breaking into her house, but then Bernarda overreacted by killing him with an egg. And I think that this is a good opportunity for forgiveness because one of my sources was a war treaty between the U.S. and Britain after they declared independence, and it talks about how forgiveness can be mutually beneficial for both parties and create better lines of forgiveness. Obviously, Carl cannot forgive Bernarda as he is, to quote Kate, a little bit dead, but I do think that that they have, like, should Carl have been alive, or should other people be forgiving on the behalf of Carl, it could open up mutually beneficial, like, paths of communication and ways for them to get past this incident.
But that kind of gets into like who has even the power to forgive, because kind of back on our first discussion, like there are people who are in power and there are people who are not, but there are also people who are able to forgive and people who are not able to. And it gets into kind of sticky situation when you are kind of up against people who are not able to defend themselves, not able to forgive, not able to give an apology even, and it's kind of like kicking a kindergartner, like you can't, like that sort of thing puts them back in the cycle of being like helpless and puts them back in the cycle of not being able to defend themselves. And I mean, I guess again, it's a like structural issue, but it's just something interesting to note.
Are you saying that it's wrong to assign a voice to them? Because I agree that, like, sometimes they can't speak up for themselves, so I'm just kind of wondering, would it be wrong to give an apology for them or to accept an apology for them? Would that infringe upon their own personal rights and privacy? And also, would that be kind of politicizing or taking away what has happened to them and using it for your own personal means?
I think it's bad. Maybe not in. I think it's bad because you're trying to make them able to do what we assume others can, like forgiveness and apology. I would say that it's not good to try to. It's like assimilating them in a way, which I would argue is not good.
And so what we've been talking about, forgiveness and all that, I think that just forgiveness in itself is a bit iffy, because forgiving usually means that somebody did something on purpose, they made a mistake. But if Bernarda was doing this out of instinct and it wasn't completely intentional, I don't know if she can actually forgive, because she herself didn't decide to do that action. It was too instinctual for her to decide, I'm going to kill him. So it's not something she can apologize for doing, because she didn't exactly have a choice in doing that action, because it was out of self-defense.
So I kind of disagree, and I think that she did have a choice, because there's a difference between self-defense and killing someone, and that also I think she, or both of them, don't deserve forgiveness for a different reason, because I think that they both did chose to commit crimes, and I think that you can't use crimes as punishment for other crimes, because both of those actions are criminal. And so although Carl is dead, I don't think he should be forgiven, because he did choose to commit a crime. And I think that Bernarda also doesn't deserve forgiveness because she killed someone. And I think that her punishment should reflect that, as we'll see in the next clip. I think this final clip brings up interesting questions of punishment and whether or not Bernarda should face legal punishment because Carl broke into her home. I think that she should, but if she doesn't, she also should face societal repercussions. She did commit an illegal action, and I think that's wrong no matter what another person did in relation to her. Carl didn't cause her to kill him, and I think that she should be societally shunned, or she should face repercussions because what she did was wrong regardless of what Carl did.
I'm not really sure my stance on this, but I think an interesting counter argument that we should be considering is that forgiveness, there's research that says that, and there's been studies on this that says that forgiveness can actually have healing effects and can improve and can help heal mental disorders that the victims have, like anxiety and PTSD. So even though Carl cannot forgive Bernarda because he's dead, it might help people like his friends and family if they could forgive her and try to move on from the incident. But there are also other ways to proceed. For example, Bernarda should take accountability for her actions by formally apologizing to the family and to prevent any further actions on her part. But also, when she does this, she should also be fair to herself and recognize that it was not something that was personally her fault. It was just her action, and that also she had some bit of justification. So she should be fair to herself, and this would prevent further actions because she would be formally recognizing that it was a wrong deed and that she would actually be taking part of the guilt as her own, which would help make her not feel encouraged to do it the next time and make her think through it if it happened again.
What
So-
if she doesn't even realize that she did something wrong, though? Because a lot of the times you hear about, like, school shootings or maybe things at, like, UT, for example, where you have someone who, like, shoots a bunch of students and then they interrogate them afterwards and they don't understand right from wrong. I mean, according to, like, the people who interview them, they don't, like, really understand that, like, maybe killing someone is not that great. And, like, what are you supposed to do then? Like, at that point, understanding what you've done wrong and apologizing for killing someone, one, isn't really a great method of, like, retribution, and two, isn't really something that'll even necessarily happen under someone who can't understand it, right?
I agree with that, and I think that it is a little bit difficult to think about methods that can actually, like, prevent the crime from happening, but I'm thinking more from the perspective of the victim's family, and that if Bernarda gave a formal recognition of her fault and what she did, it might be easier for them to forgive her, knowing that she is feeling some guilt for what she did. And I'm thinking more from the perspective of, like, his family and friends.
But does she deserve forgiveness? Because I think that formal recognition of guilt shouldn't be her only punishment.
I don't know if it matters that she deserves it if it helps the friends and family move on and if it helps them feel better about what happened.
But in addition to that, so the things you're saying kind of mimic the Swedish prison system, and they focus much more on rehabilitation than they do on returning or just punishing people for their crimes. But I think punishing people because their crimes are wrong is kind of part of what the prison system and what punishment should look like. And that I think those crimes are wrong regardless of their circumstances. And although age and mental ability do impact that, they are still wrong, and punishment should focus on the degree of the crime more than the circumstances of the criminal.
Yeah, so I agree with what you're saying, but I also agree with Ashna a bit that Bernarda should have a formal apology for the family because they need a sense of closure. Because if there's no closure and they're just kind of left hanging there, that can be very traumatizing, and trauma can leave, like, serious effects. And no matter if she's in the right or the wrong, whatever she did, just helping some other victim, a secondary victim, the family of Carl, just helping them to prevent trauma from occurring is a big deal. And I don't think the situation determines whether that's right or wrong, because I think no matter what happened, having that kind of closure for them is going to be right.
And I kind of agree. And I think that we talked really well, and I thank you all for listening, and I thank you all for discussing.